And coffee. My name's Jody, and today we're just going to review resting membrane potential and cardiac action potentials. I had to divide these up into two separate videos because the file size was too large to publish, so I'm going to create a episode A and B, but these go together. So the first one, we're just going to talk about the basics of action, resting membrane potential, action potential, and what some of these words mean. What is the sodium-potassium ATPase pump? What are the point and the role of sodium and potassium in maintaining this resting membrane potential, and then what happens when an action potential occurs. So resting membrane potential is, you have in your body, you have electrolytes. That's the common terminology for them. They're ions. Most ions are metallic, so if you look at the periodic table, these are metals that can carry charges. And just like with batteries, you have lithium-ion batteries. They used to have nickel-cadmium batteries. Batteries used to have mercury. I don't know that they still do, but all of these are different types of metals, and those metals can exist in a charged state. And so in the fact that they can carry a charge means that they can produce electricity. Just like a battery, your heart and your nervous system can generate its own charge without being plugged into the wall. So the role of sodium and potassium in this is that the cell has an intracellular space and an extracellular space, and there's a membrane that divides the two, and this membrane has embedded in it tons of ion channels and pumps which maintain a gradient of ions, which creates a charge, which in our cells that is more negative on the inside and more positive on the outside. So what this sodium and potassium ATPase pump does is it pumps out, ions want to make everything equal on both sides. They like to have even concentrations, and so the tendency is that the sodium wants to come in the cell, the potassium wants to leak out of the cell, but this pump, in order to maintain this electrical gradient, has to keep them separate, and so the pump is pumping 3 sodium out for every 2 potassium that it's pumping in. Therefore, the concentration of potassium is much higher on the inside. The concentration of sodium is much higher on the outside. There are other ions that are found inside and outside the cell, but we're not going to go into those. They don't play the dominant role in this generation of electricity. So because the pump is pumping out 3 sodium and only 2 potassium, and both sodium and potassium carry a 1+ charge, then that creates the gradient, because for every 3 pluses that go out, only 2 pluses come in. So you have a more negative charge on the inside of the cell, a more positive charge on the outside of the cell, and that pump keeps pumping the sodium out and pumping the potassium in. And knowing that there's a higher concentration of potassium inside cells, especially muscle cells and nerve cells, but it becomes important when we talk about crush injuries, burns, electrocutions, anything that causes widespread tissue damage. Knowing that potassium is in high concentrations on the inside of cells is an important thing to remember when we discuss those other pathologies in a future lecture. So always remember, potassium's higher on the inside, sodium's higher on the outside, and then we're relatively negative on the inside versus the outside, which is relatively positive. And that resting membrane potential, so this is that charge differential at rest, is about -70 millivolts, depending on what reference you look at, but -70 is the one that you commonly see. There are some small variations to that you'll see occasionally. So this is our electrical gradient at rest. Millivolts is on the y-axis, and then of course time is our x-axis, because these events take place over time. The resting membrane potential, we're going along, nothing's happening, and then a stimulus occurs. And when that stimulus occurs, you don't want to be twitching and shaking and spasming all day, every day. And so that stimulus has to be a sufficient stimulus to meet threshold. And once it meets this threshold, which on this chart is defined at -55, so remember the numbers are going down as we get less negative. So at -55, we meet threshold, and then what happens is the sodium gates open and allows the sodium that's in the higher concentration on the outside of the cell to rush in. And while that sodium is rushing in, K is kind of trying to leak out a little bit at a time, but there's so much sodium rushing in that it flips the charge. So instead of being relatively negative on the inside of the cell, this shoots way up and we become more positive on the inside and relatively negative on the outside. And that creates an electrical current. So once that event is over, the K leaks out to try to bring us back to where we were. And then, so our charge, this action potential is ending, okay? This charge is coming back down. And this pump, the sodium potassium ATPase pump, has to return the sodium and potassium to where they were in the beginning. So, and this happens very quickly, but so you are aware sodium rushes in here, potassium leaks out here as the sodium gates close, so the sodium's not rushing in anymore, potassium is leaking out, and then this pump has to return everything back to normal. And this pump is run off of ATP. So, in fact, a lot of the ATP that you generate during the day through your food, stored fat, or whatever you're using for fuel in a particular day, that creates ATP, which is basically your form of energy, and that ATP is utilized to run this pump. And a lot of the ATP that you create during the day is used to run this pump. It has to maintain this resting membrane potential in every nerve cell, every muscle cell for the entire day, and then for every action potential that occurs, and then it has to put everything back. And so a lot of your ATP is committed to maintaining not only this sodium potassium pump, but some of the other ion pumps that exist as well. And so it is a lot of the energy that you generate during the day is committed to just this alone. So just to recap, we have millivolts on this vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis, our resting membrane potential, so we're at rest, -70, so relatively negative on the inside of the cell, relatively positive on the outside of the cell. We have more sodium outside, more potassium inside, and then we have a stimulus. That stimulus meets threshold, and then sodium channels open, sodium rushes in, we flip the charge, K starts leaking out to return that electrical gradient back to the way it was, and then this the sodium potassium ATPase pump has to return this to resting membrane potential and put the sodium back where it was and put the K back where it was. So that is a brief overview of an action potential. Now, in the next video, we're going to cover a cardiac action potential because we're adding the piece of it. This is basically representative of what happens in a nerve. We have to add the piece of it that allows for muscle contraction, and so we're going to add calcium to the mix. Now, calcium is involved in nervous system action potentials, but what isn't involved here when you're just generating an electrical current from one nerve to the next is there's no contraction happening. So that doesn't occur until the nerve is encountering a muscle cell. So we're going to talk about a cardiac action potential next, and then we're also going to include the medications, antiarrhythmic medications, that intervene in each one of these steps in the cardiac action potential and the ions that are involved in creating a cardiac action potential. So I'll see you in the next video. My name's Jody, and this is Mr. Grimm and Coffee, and we'll talk about cardiac action potential next.